Welcome to the How to Not Execute Your Strategy podcast. I'm your host, Tim Ojai. This series is dedicated to the biggest lessons learned from the people who own strategic execution, the senior leaders who live in the center of it. My guest today is Dane Groeneveld. Dane is the group CEO and founding partner of the Huddl Group. The Huddl Group is a family of operating companies that provide innovative workforce solutions for clients experiencing changes in their operating model, asset portfolio, or external market conditions. Dane and his team deeply understand that quality talent is the lifeblood of any business, and he brings that perspective to today's conversation. You may also follow Dane's podcast, The Future of Work. Listen now as we explore how overly optimistic thinking creates stress and disruption. Let's get to it. Well, I am really excited today to talk to Dane today. This is going to be a fun recording. And before we go any further, Dane, properly say your last name.
Dane Groeneveld.
Groeneveld. Now, how did an Aussie get Groeneveld? Because I do a lot of work in South Africa. That sounds like a pure Dutchy accent, you know.
Yeah, it's full on Dutch, and I bet you my Dutch relatives are telling me that I'm pronouncing it wrong too.
That's awesome. Well, cool. Today we're going to dive into the same two questions we always talk about, and the first one is this: Dane, tell us about a time where you had a strategy that did not execute as planned, and what did you learn from it?
Yeah, well, most of my strategies don't execute as planned, but
I think that's a universal. I think that's universal.
Yeah, I think some of the really interesting ones have come around some of the acquisitions that we've made. We own a number of companies. One of our companies is a staffing business, and we acquired a business going back to the beginning of COVID. It was March of 2020. We signed the deal March 1st, and what was it? All of the orders, shelter-in-place orders went out, I think, on the 19th. So we've now got this business, and we're trying to integrate it. And it wasn't just a tuck-in because there was a staffing business, but there was also an engineering business. And that one, created a number of, let's call it gaps between the intentional plan and what actually executed for reasons of our own making and the market.
Well, and I'm going to go because I've walked enough through those kind of experiences. How long did it take to set up that signing date?
We probably had our first conversation in August. We had our first meeting in October. So it was about 5 to 7 months, which was quick by,
that's quick. Yeah, it is. But still, so you've got, let's just call it 6 months, half a year of planning. You're set to go. This thing people are calling COVID, and it seems to be really bad in Europe. And we're kind of like, holy crap, what's going to happen over here? And then all of a sudden it starts popping up, and we were both in California at the time, so California started getting hit hard. What was going through your mind then as you were going through the signing date, as you were going into this? Were you thinking it's going to be okay? Were you thinking, holy crap, why are we doing this? What was
it was sheer optimism and excitement. Nothing's going to go wrong. These are great people. This is what we've always wanted to do. Let's go do it.
It's wild. Okay, so let's unpeel this story a little bit. So you sign, and you are full of optimism. You're ready to rock, and next thing you know, this thing gets worse.
Yeah, it gets really bad because those shelter-in-place orders go out, and all of a sudden, we're trying to work out if we're a frontline industry. Most of our people up there in the Bay Area are deployed on refinery sites. So fortunately, they were, first line employees, but we're having to go through all of the safety, all of the communications, the change management, the billing cycle. We're doing everything at once. Everything just gets squeezed into this chaotic period of, 6 to 12 weeks of trying to, it's daily survival, let's be honest.
Wow. Yeah. So, if you were to rewind the tape and do different things, what were some of the things that you would do differently?
Yeah, good question. I think we would absolutely have gone forward with the plan to do the transaction. Benefit of hindsight is that we got through it.
Yeah.
I think we would likely have spent a little bit more time in the planning in the month ahead. We would have probably taken time to say what could go wrong, because we never did that. And I think had we spent more time with the sort of integration planning and the what could go wrong, rather than a lot of the time, as often happens in transactions, just trying to get the deal signed. We probably would have had the team on deck, more aware of our, responsibilities, accountabilities, and likely putting a clearer message out there to our people.
So you executed without a plan B. What was the impact on that, on your decision making and your executing? You said it was daily survival, but break us or pull us into some of the more literal examples of what that was like.
So the first thing we're doing is we're explaining to our customers, hey, the acquisitions happened. We're going to be changing some of the vendor registrations, the payment details. We're moving some of our employees onto a new benefit scheme because they're becoming absorbed by PTS Advance, the staffing business. And that's going on while most of those customers are distracted with what's going on with COVID. So they're not really hearing it and seeing it. And then they're asking us, what can we do to do temperature checking at the gate? And, if someone's an employee over the age of 65, should we even be bringing them on site, even though they're qualified to be on site, because we've got a higher risk because we don't know anything about this virus?
Wow.
So a lot of those types of conversations are going on day by day, department by department. And naturally, our employees in the field are starting to ask questions because they're getting paid for the hours worked, exempt or non-exempt, but they're deployed on assignment. So they're kind of saying, wow, if this site shuts down, where's my income protection? So we're communicating with lots of different people day by day. And one thing the team did a really good job of is we pulled the team together in sort of reactive mode, was actually sit down and think through those different personas, the customer that pays us, the customer who's deploying the talent that we're providing, the talent themselves, and starting to understand what's important to each of them as it pertains to safety, income, knowing what might be ahead, what bumps are in the road.
Wow. So you've not only got the execution responsibility, you've got this emotional responsibility that you have to take as a leader. And that's just a different skill set, right? That's completely different to keep people emotionally engaged while you're trying to keep them in motion, professionally. Yeah.
The emotional piece is a great point, Tim. I mean, that was probably the hardest because you can't grab it, you can't measure it. You just know people are in an emotional state of distress. And so we had this team going out to make changes to workflows and documentation and communications, but we had to kind of rally them around each day. We hadn't got the chance to really get together in person and do some of the human connecting that helps make these changes easier. So one of the things that we did on the emotional side, we started a daily call every morning. I would wake up, I think, at about 7. I couldn't get up and surf like I normally do. So I'd be up at 7 and I'd be there scanning the internet for good news stories and posters, and we'd get the whole company together, not just the acquisition integration team. And we started to kind of rally a little bit of morale and emotional support for people and talk about what we were scared about, what we were learning, but create a bit of a shared environment for that emotional hygiene, I guess you could call it.
Yeah. So how did you keep your leadership team in that same space? Because you can't run around and do it for everybody. Your sphere of influence is only so big. So how did you make sure that your leaders were doing their own version of emotional hygiene and how they were injecting energy into the business?
That's a good question. I mean, at that time, we only had about 50 internal employees. So the daily call was everyone from the
company wide.
From the entry level roles all the way up to the CEO. And so we did the company wide town hall every morning, and that kind of fueled the team with conversation. It allowed me to play a little bit more of like a emotional leader, figurehead through the choppiness. But it also gave the team a lot of talking points as they went and sat down virtually in most cases, because we were all at home still, with their employees to talk about things that we're doing, or with their customers. But, one of the interesting things there, and I was very fortunate to have the team that we had, is that the team that was on that call, every level of the business, would pick up on some of the themes that we were talking about around safety and mental wellness and family, because a lot of people were thrown into a crisis in their families with kids
Yeah,
not in
sure.
school and all sorts of things. And so they were then going out and sharing that same sentiment, that same message with their customers. So I think the team did a really good job of rallying around some of those early behaviors at the beginning of the day and using it appropriately, in their personal lives and in their work lives.
Which leads us directly into the next question. And what are 2 or 3 skills you think everybody in the organization should have? I mean, we've talked about this whole idea of emotional, and I use the word human energy. How do you maintain and steward your human energy as a business? That may be
Yeah.
a skill, but what, from your experience, what are the 2 or 3 things you think not just leaders, but everybody needs to have if they're going to execute really well?
One of the ones that I think it would be great for everyone in the team to have is courage, and it's really easy to say and really hard to achieve.
Mm.
We've been talking to a lot of thought leaders and experts around the importance of courage in teams.
Yeah.
Let's be honest, problem solving in situations that we've been through and in situations that others go through is a bit of a team sport these days. There's just so much data. There are so many moving parts. There are so many stakeholders. And the only way a team can really execute well is if they have the courage to say, hey, Tim, I really need you to go a little bit wider when they make that play. Or Bob or Jenny, could you guys, let me know what I'm not seeing when I'm going down this path, when I'm making this communication, or when I'm completing this analysis. So I think courage is like it's a 101 essential skill that the whole team needs.
It's hard because I've worked with very, very large. I've worked in very, very large companies, all the way down to startups and nonprofits in South Africa, and that is something that's universal. I honestly, it's you're getting down to the culture of the company, and are you allowed to speak up? So, and I know you're a huge advocate for how culture impacts the health of your business and the health of your revenue. So, let's stay here for a moment. How do you make sure courage is alive? Is it something you train? Is it something you hire? Is it something you just, how do you make sure courage is in place?
I'd like to say I hire for it. I certainly look for it when we're hiring, but the hiring interface is so narrow and short-lived. It's hard to believe that we actually get that right. So you'll ask a few behavioral questions, but I think it's about training for it. I think you've got to. And trust me, I'm still working at this. I've got more scar tissue than not. But I think you've got to create really good examples where the leaders in the teams that the people are looking up to are being courageous, either in asking for feedback or giving a peer feedback. And sometimes that has to be public. There's this age-old sentiment that you praise in public and you correct in private, but actually sometimes I think we need to do a much better job of correcting in public. And we need to make sure that we remove the emotion, it's not barbed, and that we're saying, hey team, we didn't do this right, the learning moment is this, and here's a good example of me having that conversation with someone else, and then you create that psychological safety for others to be courageous, for sure.
That's huge. And I want to crack open this idea. We said the word training. We're not talking about sending people to a class. I'm using training like you would as an athlete. It's just, it's Monday. It's a training day because the game will be Saturday or Sunday. And the training is happening live in the moment as you run your business. So as you said, in the meeting, in real time, that is the actual training. It's not formal. It's just part of the Tuesday schedule.
Yeah. I think I've always loved that analogy, Tim, of athletes in the field. It's drills, and work isn't always just the task that we're completing. It's how we're doing it and how we're connecting with each other. I think you're right. I think it has to be live fire, learn by doing.
Well, and this gets into then the whole concept of hierarchical thinking, if I get my words around that. Most of us have been taught to think in terms of hierarchy, and that it's like a command chain like the military, and the higher rank begets lesser dialogue. And the reality is it's much more like a sporting event where you have people on the sideline and people on the pitch, and everybody is equal, whether you're the trainer who's running on the field with water and bringing water and other stuff with you to check on somebody, and running back to the sideline. You have an equal role as whoever's the captain of the offense, etc., and the coaches and all the, and there's no hierarchy. It's just, look, we are playing to win as a group. And I don't think enough people make that leap between how they've structured themselves and their ability to generate courage as a result of that structure. Would you say that you see the same thing?
I think you're right. There was a study on peak performance that came out of New Zealand that looked at the All Blacks rugby team, and it said the reason this team's awesome is that everyone is encouraged to do thinking and to do doing and to do telling. Like, it's not hierarchical. And so some of the best players were in there sweeping out the sheds afterwards.
And that's the way it works.
And you can build that in a sports team, but building it in a business is not as easy. There's a great thinker on this space, Eric Coriel, who I've done some work with, and Eric talks about the fact that people have this contract not to call each other out at work. It's an unwritten contract because our work, there's a lot of pressure, there's a lot of stress. I've got to perform, it's my income, it's my livelihood, it's my ego. And it's not a team environment where if you lose at the weekend, you dust back up at training and adjust. Sometimes if you lose at the weekend, your job's on the line, you've lost some currency, and there's too much at stake. So I think that's a big reason why leaders and, the wider team are not really drilling these behaviors of courage on a week-to-week basis. And I can't say I do either. I get the theory, but it's hard to put into practice.
It is hard to do. It is hard to do, especially if you're like a recovering type A like me. You want to win, so sometimes you let winning get in the way of everything else. But at the same time, you can't do it by yourself. So let's go to another skill. So we've got courage, and we've dug a pretty deep hole around that. Where would you put another? We'll call it a tent pole for the rest of the organization?
Look, I think what goes hand in hand with courage is actually clarity of your role on that team. Because you can be courageous and say something, but if you don't really understand your own role, you're not going to be really understanding the context of what's going on and where you can make those adjustments. So clarity of role, if everyone could just be clear on what they do and how it helps others, and they could communicate it in that easy way, then often when you run into these problems, you can explain, you can externalize what that problem is. You can say, look, the problem is I'm responsible for getting payroll out every Tuesday, and I'm not getting accurate data to get the payroll out, and therefore we're at risk of hurting our employees and falling foul of labor laws by not getting payroll right. That's a much better approach to the clarity of my role and what I might need from someone else, rather than me saying, you guys are making a mess of the timesheets. That doesn't tell anyone anything, right?
So how do you make clarity a skill set? What are the things that you have to do in order to create clarity? Because you're talking, and just so you know, that is to me the number one thing that leaders can do if they're going to fix something and get their execution back on track. The lowest hanging fruit and the most common problem is injecting clarity. So how do you make sure people have that? What's the skills that are attached to that?
Well, I can tell you how I've done it wrong a lot of times, which is me trying to set the clarity for other people, because then you don't use the right language and you're not really thinking about how their job functions. So I think the difficult answer to that question is you need to give people time to actually sit down and understand their own role and really document it and then share it with a peer. I think that's the simplest way. Now, that means a lot of people have to do a lot of work and a lot of communication and honing, but at least they'll find a way to do it for themselves. And they're not being given this desktop procedure that says, this is what my job does, because they're never going to pick that back up and use it to explain anything.
No. Well, so I'm a huge fan of GRPI. Do you know GRPI?
I don't know.
Oh, okay. So GRPI or Grippy or Gerpy was developed in the 70s, made popular in the 80s at GE. So when Jack Welch was transforming GE into number one, number two, and everything else, Noel Tishy and Ram Charan were two of his top folks there to help him with all of that. And what they did was created a model that said, if you want high performance teaming, the root cause problem is going to be goal clarity. Then it's going to be role clarity. then it will be fix the process, then it will be the
Ah,
interpersonal stuff. And they found that most people see the interpersonal conflict and they go, oh man, we need a team building event, or we need communication skills, or we need, I don't know, pick
yeah,
something. And everybody goes after these interpersonal skills when the problem is, well, are the processes working the way they're supposed to? And if they're not, maybe you should fix that first. And it's amazing how often the interpersonal stuff cleans up once the process works the way it's supposed to. But before you go fix the process, are people clear on their roles? Because the reason the handoffs aren't working is the roles are not aligned. And if the roles are clear,
yeah,
not only my role, but I know what your role is and you know what my role is, the tendency for you to try to redo my work or do my job or even undo my job goes down dramatically. But more importantly, do we even have the same goal? Is our definition of success the same? And it's
yeah,
amazing how often companies don't have clarity around the goal. So people make up their own definition of what the goal is, or they add their own definitions to it. And then
yeah,
roles are completely spun off in another direction as a result of that. So when you talk about this idea of spending time on your clarity, especially with the role, and not going to fix the process, that's like backed up with decades of business experience. And I'm amazed at how
yeah,
often I see people coming in and trying to, here's, well, okay, we're going to redo the sales process, or we're going to redo, the payroll process. I'm like, guys, that's not the problem. Trust me.
yeah. So it's got to be starting with that goal and then cascading down.
That's right.
I really like that.
So let's crack this open a bit. When you're looking for talent and when you're looking for
Mhm.
somebody who's got real potential to kind of take on more responsibility, they've got the courage you're looking for. They understand how to create clarity and how to even ask for it if they can't do it themselves. Um,
Yeah,
is there anything else you're looking for? And like, wow, you've got something special that makes you go,
yeah.
I want to pay attention to you.
I the later I get into my career, the more I realize that this might be a blind spot. But I've always asked um, and explored how sort of impatient people are, because I've always enjoyed impatience in my fellow colleagues, bosses, team members, because it means they're not going to sit around and put up with something that
Yeah.
isn't optimal. And
Yeah.
so impatience means that you can then create a team that's telling you a lot of what's going wrong, but at least you're getting the feedback.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's impatience is one of those funky things where it seems like if I'm impatient and kind while I'm doing it, that's
Good point.
acceptable. But if I'm a jerk, then
Yeah.
I've got problems. The problem then goes back to sometimes we need that robust transparency with our impatience, and we've got some pretty thin-skinned folks out there. Um, is
Yeah, we
is
do.
that is that part of the equation then, is to kind of work with people on that? It's not one or the other. You've got to be kind. You've got to be
Yeah.
thick-skinned. So is it about balancing that?
I think it is balanced because you can't expect everyone to have that whole spectrum covered up. I certainly don't. And then emotional events will trigger different behaviors. So
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
it's about finding that balance. Funnily enough, in some teams that I've worked in, we would often create a role. Like we would say, "Hey, you get to be the bullshit ringer. You know,
Oh
you ring
yeah.
it if someone's gone off, you know, off track and is saying stuff that doesn't hold out, and then someone else has to be sort of the empathy champion, just to say, we're all going to turn up differently every day, but who's keeping an eye out for some of those behaviors, particularly if they are unkind.
So how do you make sure your team has that? Again, is that back to something you have to build within your culture and kind of
I
grow that
think I
skill?
think it is. I think that's
Yeah.
a hygiene factor, right? It's
Mm,
you can't just do an event and hope it's there forever. You can't bring in a great speaker, send someone to do a LinkedIn learning course. It's again, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. It's drilling every week, you know, doing that real time courage to speak up if someone goes off track or if they're being unkind. And I think that's why executing strategy is so hard, because it means that we all have to kind of embrace that discomfort on a day in day out basis. There is no silver bullet.
yeah. And so emotional hygiene literally has to be anchored not only to your culture, but all the way through down to how decisions are made in meetings.
Yeah,
And you've got to call that out as your leaders are, to make sure that they're looking for it. And I'll go one step, they're rewarding it. And I don't know how that works in your own culture, your own business, but it seems like the rewarding factor needs to be brought into this. And I'm sure people could have fun with it. I mean,
I
everything
think
from
they could.
rubber chickens to, Starbucks cards or whatever, but you could probably
Yeah.
have fun with it if you wanted to.
We've been informally trying to reward through like an app with some kudos,
Yeah.
but actually we don't do a good enough job on the reward. I think you made an interesting point there, particularly with the newer generation entering the workforce, and there's this sense that they're not thick-skinned. But I don't think that's true. I think that's a generalization. But with the new workforce that we're into, whether it's the generation entering it or just the way that we work now, there is a need to be doing more of the actual, I think, recognition and reward. I think that's often missed.
Yeah, I'm gonna jump on that a little bit just because we have just a couple minutes left. Do you
Yeah,
think that's generational, or do you think that's more just youth? And when you're younger, your thinner skin is when you're older. Because I've kind of moved away from, I used to be huge into
yeah.
generational things, and yeah, there's patterns to it and there's truth to it. But at the same time, it just seems like, nah, the older millennials I know are now complaining about the things that we as Gen X used to complain about, and just in a different way. But
I
everybody
think
seems
you're
to
right.
have,
There is a bit of a rite of passage, a cycle, but I think that's exacerbated now more than ever.
mm,
There's a lot of post-traumatic stress in the workforce from what we've gone through in the
yeah,
last few years,
very
and
much
not
so.
just COVID, by the way. All
Yeah,
of the other crises we've gone through,
yep,
from September 11th right through financial crises, the
yeah,
Me Too movements.
yeah,
There's just a lot going on in our lives,
yeah.
and social media. So I think right now you can't generalize or just assume that because someone's been there for a certain tenure or they've been in the industry for a while that they're going to be able to deal with whatever's turning up on the day.
Absolutely
So
right.
I
I
think
think that's
that's
really
why
well
the
said.
reward and recognition probably is more important now than ever. And it's not the pizza parties. It's actual going and physically manifesting this personal connection that,
Wow.
that says, hey, thanks for standing up and saying that on behalf of your colleague or on behalf of the business or the customer. But I think you need to go out of your way at a personal level to get that right.
That is so good. That's actually a perfect place to stop. Dane, that last point actually really resonates. How you get away from pizza parties. And hey, I love pizza, so don't stop the
Yeah,
pizza parties, but it's that extra reward because I am trying to train. I am trying to discipline. I am, and not in the hard discipline, but like as an athlete, I want discipline. I want training. I want skill development. So it becomes
yeah,
muscle memory and emotional muscle
yeah.
memory. Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. Well, again, thanks again for being on this call and joining my first season. I have respect for what you do and how you do it. There's not a lot of CEOs out there running their own podcasts about how to have healthy organizations, but that people side of business is what makes business worth doing. And I appreciate
Oh, it
that.
absolutely does. It's so rewarding. Thanks, Tim. It's been an honor to be on the show with you, and just great getting to know you more and more.
That was so good. What really jumped out to me was Dane's overall focus on how people drive execution, not the plan. I'm curious, what are your biggest takeaways and how are you going to use them? My three biggest takeaways are: beware the trap of overly optimistic thinking. Nothing is going to go wrong, right? Spend time thinking about what could go wrong and then make sure your people are prepared for their responsibilities and accountabilities before you launch your strategy. The team has to be both tactically and emotionally engaged. Emotional engagement needs its own effort. Emotional hygiene is the responsibility of every leader. And patience is more valuable than we realize. We all need thick skin to be able to execute. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with at least one person and leave me a review on whatever platform you downloaded this podcast. Your feedback is invaluable to me. And Imua, onward and upward.